Go ahead and get out your journals and turn to your unit title page. Today's lesson is 1.4, End Behavior. I don't know if any of you are going to have to take a college calculus class, but if you do, this concept comes up a lot in calculus, okay? It's the introduction to limits, and college calculus has a lot to do with limits. So anyways, that's why we're going to be learning it today. Okay, go ahead and turn to your notes page. Also, make sure that you have your calculator and that you're following along, because on your practice that you're going to have to do, you have to make sure that you are aware of the calculator. And since I'm not with you in class, obviously I can't be there to walk you through it. So make sure you're on your calculator and you're following along with the notes. I'm going to be filming myself on the calculator so that you can see what we're doing. Alright, so let's start with end behavior and talk about what that even means. End behavior describes the f of x or y values, because remember, f of x and y is the same thing, as the x approaches the left or right side of the graph. So the left side of the graph would be the left x-axis, which would be all your negative x values, which is why it's approaching negative infinity. And then the right side is the right side of your x-axis, which would be where all of your x's are approaching positive infinity. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by graphing this into our calculators. And then we're going to look at the left side of the graph and determine if it points up, levels out, or points down. And then we're going to be looking at the right side of the graph as well and determining if it points up, levels out, or points down. So let's go ahead and graph this. Okay, whenever I go to a new graph, it should look like this. Don't y'all love that I give you all these pretty white new calculators? I thought you would. And since we're doing a fraction, go ahead and hit Control, Divide, and it's going to pop up this fraction option. This is the easiest way to type in stuff in your calculator that has fractions so that it doesn't get messed up with order of operations. So now we're going to type in 6 over 2 plus e to the negative x. Okay, e to the x button is down here. And then we're going to raise it to the negative x. And then hit enter. Alright, so we get a graph that looks like this. So let's start off on the left side. And as you can tell, that this graph on the left side levels out. So what value is this graph approaching? So I want to look at, as my x values go more to the negative, as I'm going to the left side, this graph, my y values are approaching 0. They're getting really, really, really close to it. Okay, this is an asymptote. It's leveling out at 0. And then on the right side of the graph, I can tell that it's doing the same thing. It's leveling out to a certain value. So what y value is this graph approaching? 1, 2, 3. So we can see that on the right side, this graph is leveling out to a y value of 3. So on the left side, the graph leveled out, so we would select B. And f of x, remember, is the same thing as y. Our f of x values or y values were approaching a certain number, and that number was 0. So right here, I would write n equals 0. Now let's switch and go to the right side. I'm going to switch colors to green. On the right side, the graph was also leveling out as well. If you want, we could sketch a picture of what this graph looked like, okay? It started up here, and then it leveled off to 0, and then leveled off up here to positive 3. So since it also leveled out, we would select B, and instead of approaching 0, the y values approached 3. Alright, let's move down here to this next one. So now go ahead and hit Tab on your calculator, and we're going to be typing in this function, e to the x. Alright, so now I have e to the x tapped in, and this is what your graph should look like. It's an exponential graph. So let's take a look at the left side and right side. So as I look at the left side, as my x values are approaching negative infinity because they're growing more into the negative direction, I can tell that this graph also levels out to 0. Okay, it's getting really, really, really close to 0 on this left side. But then on the right side of the graph, it's not leveling out. It just keeps increasing exponentially. It just keeps growing and growing and growing. So I would say that the end behavior as x approaches positive infinity, because my x's are getting bigger, they're growing, 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 my y values are going to infinity. So they're pointing up. So let's go ahead and sketch that on this graph. It looks like my y-intercept's at positive 1, and then on the left side it levels out to 0, and on the right side it just points up. It just keeps increasing. Alright, so now what I want you to do is look at the table values for this graph. So I know that it levels out over here on the left side, and then on the right side it just keeps increasing, so it keeps pointing up to infinity. So go ahead and hit Control T on your calculator and pull up your table. Whenever you pull up a table, it should look like this, where you can see your x values on the left and then your f of x or y values on the right. So we want to scroll up to -1 because that's the first value on our table in the notes. And we would get 0.36. Keep scrolling up because we're getting more into the negatives. Remember, our x's are approaching negative infinity, so we're just going to keep growing more into the negatives. We get 0.006 for -5. And when I go to when x equals -10, I get 0.00045. So what number do you think my y values are approaching? Obviously, we already talked about it, that they're approaching 0 because you can see that on the graph. But also, if I keep scrolling up, these numbers keep getting closer and closer to 0, okay? Don't get confused by this. This is 8.31, but it's times 10 to the -7. So that means there's really 7 zeros in front of that 8. It'd be like 0.0000007, okay? Now for the right side of the graph, we want to scroll all the way down to +1, and we're going to keep going to the positive x's because our x's are approaching positive infinity. So I have 1 for my x, and my y is at 2.7. And then let's go all the way down to 5. I get 148.4. So see how it keeps growing? My y's are getting bigger and bigger. Now let's go all the way to 10. When x equals 10, I'm already at 22,026.5. And if you just keep scrolling, these numbers keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, like to the millions, billions, etc. So we can see that this graph is not leveling out on the table values. The y values just keep growing and growing and growing. Alright, so make sure you have those table values filled out. So on the left side, I have -1 is 0.36, -5, and then 0.0067, -10, 0.00045. So we could tell that as my graph kept going more to the left, my y values were getting closer and closer to 0. So as x approaches negative infinity, what does the function do? Whenever we're describing in behavior, we're either going to say points up, levels out, or points down, okay? So up here, you may want to write that by A, points up, B's, levels out, and then C's, points down. So this graph leveled out, and my f of x values were approaching 0. Now let's go to the right side. You should have gotten 1, 2.71, 5, 148.4, and then 10, 22,026. So we can tell that these y values keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger because this side of the graph is growing to infinity. So as x approaches positive infinity, what does the function do? And we would say it points up. And my y values are approaching positive infinity as well because they just keep growing to positive infinity. All right, now let's switch and go to the next example. So hit Tab or Control T first to get out of your table, and then hit Tab to pull up your graph, or Control G. If that's too confusing, just hit a new document and pull up a whole new graph. Alright, so go ahead and type in x divided by x minus 4. Make sure you hit Control Divide so that you can put x in the numerator and x minus 4 in the denominator. And this is what your graph should look like. So take a couple seconds to sketch that on your notes. Sorry for the video being so shaky. Hope I'm not making you sick. Okay, so let's talk about the left and right side, just looking at this graph. So on the left side, as my x's are going into the negative infinity, I can tell that it levels out, and it looks like it's approaching the value of 1. It's getting closer and closer to 1. And then on the right side, I have got two things going on here. I've got this little thing, which we're just going to ignore because that's not the most right side of the graph. We're going to come up here to this one, and we're going to look at this right side. This is actually a rational graph, is why it looks like this. So as my x values are growing bigger in the positive direction, I can tell that this graph is actually leveling out as well. So we're going to see what value that this is leveling out at on the right side. So let's start on our table values, and you're going to hit Control T. Okay, if you'll notice in your notes, we start at negative 10 and then go all the way to negative 100 and then negative 500. It would take forever if I kept scrolling this table all the way up to negative 500. So let's go ahead and change our table settings to get to negative 500 in a faster way. So you're going to hit Menu, number 2 for Table, and then number 5 to edit table settings. We want to start at 0, and then let's just go by tens. So you're starting at 0, and then you're going to increase by tens. So now I can scroll up to negative 10 and get 0.714. And then let's go to negative 50. My y value is at 0.92. Negative 100, 0.96. I'm getting closer and closer to 0.9. And then let's go all the way up to 500. Now it's not too far to scroll since we're only going by tens. 0.99. So it looks like we're getting closer to 1. Okay, if you wanted to, we could jump all the way to like negative 10,000 and see what that value is at. .9996. So as you can tell, whenever my x is at negative 10,000, which is a really big number, my y value is at 0.9996. So it's getting really, really, really close to 1. Now let's switch and go to the right side. I'm going to go back to 0 where I was. Okay, so y'all come back down to 0. You can either scroll there or do it in your table settings. And this time we're looking at the right side. So we want to look at whenever our x's are positive, because we're looking when x is approaching positive infinity. So if I go to when x is 10, I get 1.666. And then at 50, we get 1.08. 100, 1.04, and all the way to 500. It looks like at 500, we're at 1.008. So as I keep going into the positive direction, my y's keep getting closer and closer to 1 on the right side as well. Alright, so on the left side of this graph, make sure you have these table values recorded, 0.714, 0.925, 0.961, 0.992. So as I'm looking at the left side of this graph, we know that it's leveling out. And my f of x values were approaching +1. Now let's look at the right side. 1.66, 1.08, 1.04, and then 1.008. So on the right side, this one also leveled out as well. And my y values, or f of x values, also were approaching 1 as well. Okay, so on your practice, you're going to be doing the same thing. It's going to look more like this first page on the, or the first section up here. You're going to have a circle, and you're just going to move the circle over your answer choice, A, B, or C. And then on the back, you're going to be doing the table. So I have a text box, and you're going to be typing in your answers in the text box, and then picking if it levels out, points up or down, and then if it does level out, you have to state at what value. If you have any questions, let me know. Hope you guys have a great day.